All right, how we doing? My name is Coach John McLernan with Freedom Nutrition Coaching, and it's awesome to have you here with me. I'm excited to talk about what I think is kind of like two brains in one. So what we want to tackle here is, do you ever find yourself saying, I know what to do, but I can't seem to do it? Isn't that a fascinating problem? So today, I'm going to show you 6 proven strategies to use your fast brain and your slow brain to get unstuck. So that at the end of this video, you're going to be empowered knowing that you can go from knowing what to do to doing it and making it easier and automatic. So let's dive in. So for me, some of you might know my backstory, where I struggled for many, many years trying to lose weight. I went to Google, I found dozens of different meal plans, I tried many different diets, I got really heavily into supplement science. There was so many different things that I was trying and so much information that I was consuming, kind of like I was looking for answers. But in reality, what I was struggling with is that I knew what to do in theory. So I knew about the meal plans. I had the supplement ideas. I knew about the various diets that existed. But the problem is I could never seem to stick to it. I could push myself for long enough to lose a certain amount of weight, but very soon afterwards I would basically just burn out and give up and go back to what I was doing before. So I wonder if you ever had an experience like this. This is what we call the gap, or living in the gap. And this gap is really the space between knowing and doing. So I wonder if you've ever struggled with, becoming aware or finding yourself repeating a pattern. Something like going back to the pantry at night, eating a little more than you should at mealtime. Things like this are exactly that, living in the gap between knowing and doing. That place where we say, I know what to do, why can't I do it? And very often it's tempting to blame ourselves, to get discouraged, to get frustrated. But I like to dig a little deeper and say, is there a brain-based explanation for this? And this is where I want to talk about these 2 brain systems, our fast brain and our slow brain. So did you know that we make approximately 35,000 decisions per day? 35,000 decisions a day. Wow, that's a huge number. And did you know that your brain, it processes every second approximately 11 million bits of information? Now, thankfully, most of this happens on autopilot. We create patterns and we create what's known as heuristics, basically a shortcut that we don't have to think about when it comes to decision making. It's not perfect, but it works most of the time. So we're kind of describing here the fast brain, which could be known as like the unconscious mind. For example, have you ever found yourself driving to or from a really familiar place? Example, driving to or from work. And you drive there and you get there and you think, wow, I don't even remember driving here. How did I get here safely? Well, you did that on autopilot. You did that with your fast brain. Your slow brain was going and daydreaming about something else, while the rest of you, the trip, you were operating on autopilot. Now, the fast brain can also be described sometimes as emotional, sometimes it seems irrational. It's really about shortcuts and quick judgments. This part of our brain, the goal here is actually to save us a ton of work. It's also the part of our brain that really forms habits. So you remember I said we process up to 11 million bits of information per second. Well, up to 98% of our brain function takes place in this fast brain, right? And that's where a lot of this processing is happening. So the other half, or not half, but the other part of our brain, we could call the slow brain or the thinking brain, the thinky brain. This is where the conscious part of our brain function exists. And we could be processing maybe 50,000 inputs per second with some degree of consciousness. But really, it's as little as 2% of our thinking or conscious brain function is taking place in this part of our brain. So this part of our brain is really known as the planner, the problem solver, the one that weighs up or thinks about the consequences of our action. If I do this, what might happen? It's the one that thinks about what we should do and maybe even why we should do this. It's also the part of our brain that deals with willpower and decision making. So these are functions of the so-called slow brain. Now, our day-to-day life is kind of like a race between the two of these, the tortoise and the hare. And which one's going to win? Well, most times it's going to be the fast brain because it's simply faster. Now, sometimes, in fact, a lot of times, this is a really good thing. For example, let's say you're faced with, you're going for a hike, and you're faced with a bear in your path. You see that up ahead. Well, if you kind of stand there and, I'm just going to check the wind, I wonder what's around me, and you start to process with your slow brain while you're putting yourself at risk, whereas your fast brain goes, boom, let's get out of here without thinking about it because it recognizes there's a threat. So that's, kind of an example where our fast brain is really beneficial, where we don't have time in a situation like that to kind of pause and think and consider a number of factors. It's act now. I want to mention something quickly about overwhelm. So now, as we become maybe aware of some of these things, and as we become more aware of maybe what we're working to solve, we can begin to feel a sense of overwhelm. So overwhelm is when, I like to describe it as trying to solve all our problems all at once inside our head. So it's moving a number of things all at once into our conscious brain, or the slower brain. And the slow brain, really when we're talking about this, we're not talking about, that something's wrong with it. We're talking about kind of more like the tortoise versus the hare. The tortoise and the hare fable, where, the hare would stop and start and stop and start, and the tortoise just kept kind of slowly plodding along. So when we're living kind of on autopilot without thinking about it, that's our fast brain dictating the action, and that happens a lot of the time. It's kind of for efficiency purpose. But the slow brain actually has an advantage, and that is when we become aware of, let's say, an unhelpful pattern of behavior or habit that we have, we can actually design a change. And that's really what I want to get to the heart of here. I want to share with you 6 ways that we can actually utilize design to bridge the gap between the slow brain and the fast brain. Now, of course, I want to make sure that I emphasize you don't have to choose or try to do all of these all at once. And in fact, what I'd like you to do is maybe listen to each example that I give here and just choose one that sticks out for you and try that. You can always come back and try other ones, but our brains do better when we just try to correct one thing at a time. So thinking about how we can utilize kind of the strengths and mitigate some of the weaknesses of each the fast brain and the slow brain. So one way that we can do this is to introduce friction. What we're trying to do here in this case is slow down an automatic behavior. So I'll give you an example. Where I live, there's a store not too far from us. It's a chocolate store. It's a Lindt chocolate store. So maybe those foil wrapped, sort of gourmet chocolate balls. They're in that red foil and it has like a creamy center, and they're delicious. They're incredible. So my wife and I go to this Lindt store, and they happen to have a sale on, which is probably even more problematic in one sense. They're having a sale on something that's basically like chocolate crack. And so we buy 100 of these Lindt balls for like $20. And so we get home, and we, the way that chocolate goes in our household, we divvied up 50-50, right? So 50 for her, 50 for me. Now, for my wife, the kind of person that she is, she's happy just taking this her portion of these chocolate balls and just putting them somewhere and sort of eating them every once in a while whenever she's sort of on a whim. But they could sit there for like 6 months and just sort of eating one, almost like one every week. But for me, it's problematic because I really want to eat them because they're on my mind and I know that they're there. So one of the things that I did in this case was actually put some of these chocolate balls in the freezer. So I kind of took them out of an easy to find space, so that if I wanted them, I had to go downstairs into my basement and into my cellar and go to where the freezer is and to pick a couple of them out. So it just meant that I had to, I couldn't just impulsively grab them. I had to go somewhere, and in the process of going there to deliberately, seek out these chocolate balls, I could decide whether or not I actually wanted them. So it's almost like a type of environmental design, and we're going to touch on that as well. But this just introducing friction between the impulse to eat them and the actual action. So thinking about that, I'm wondering, how could you implement this strategy? Another example of this would be what I call the stop sign method, and that is, okay, for example, let's say you go to a place like Costco where they sell really like industrial sized bags of chips. The way that our brain works is when we have a food in some kind of container, we're very likely to eat to the bottom of the container. Now, that's not such a bad thing if your container is like one of those tiny little sandwich bags, but when it's a Costco sized bag of chips, that can be a little bit more problematic because we're more likely to overconsume. Even if we don't consume the entire bag, we're going to consume more than we might otherwise because it's such a big container. And so this stop sign method is taking that big bag of chips and portioning it out into smaller, say, Ziploc bags, for example, or just smaller containers. What we're doing is, so then if I wanted some chips, I would go and get one of those containers and take that to wherever I was going to go eat the chips. At the end of consuming that container, I stop and think, do I want another one? So what I'm doing is I'm introducing a little bit of friction. I'm introducing a little stop sign instead of just, mindlessly consuming until I reach the bottom of the bag. Just to give you kind of an example of how powerful our kind of automatic brain can be. There was a study that was conducted on moviegoers and how they eat popcorn. And what they were looking at was they gave some people a small size and some a medium and some a large size. And everybody ate until their fingers were scraping the bottom of the container. Whether it was a super duper jumbo size or a tiny size, they just ate however much popcorn they were given because they're in a movie and they're not really thinking about it. What they didn't tell the moviegoers is that this popcorn was 2 weeks old. It was stale popcorn. So that's how powerful our automatic brain can be. And this fact that if something's in a container, we'll eat our way to the bottom of that container. So some other things that we could think about are to think about introducing friction might be taking snacks away from eye level in the pantry, because if they're right there, they're easy to grab. Or buying pre-portioned snacks. That's a similar idea to the stop sign method, where we buy pre-portioned snacks, maybe a package of like 2 cookies instead of a sleeve of cookies. So number 2 is this idea of a pattern interrupt. Now, I always like to think if I had a spray like they do on that TV show, that investigative crime show called CSI, you could, spray that and you shine the ultraviolet light and you can find things that you can't see with the naked eye. Well, if we were to do that, we could probably find a movement pattern throughout the house. So it's like, have you ever found yourself just kind of mindlessly staring at the fridge with the door open, or wandering into the pantry and just kind of blankly staring? This is just an automatic pattern of behavior. This is your fast brain working. And what we want to do is say, well, can we create an interrupt of that pattern? Because the pattern might be, for example, you get home from work, you drop your keys in that little bowl by the door, and you walk over to the pantry and you open the pantry and you go, what's in there? And it just happens without even really thinking about it. Maybe another way that you can introduce a pattern interrupt is to put a sticky note on, say, like a bag of chips. So let's say you did have one of those big Costco-sized bag of chips and you didn't do the stop sign method. You could put a sticky note on that bag of chips and say, do you really need those right now? That's a little bit of a pattern interrupt to make you consciously think about it. So to move from that autopilot of the fast brain to the conscious slow brain to then make a decision. Another simple example would be something like wearing a rubber band on your wrist. Whenever you start thinking a negative thought, you snap that rubber band, or whenever you start getting a craving for something, you snap that rubber band, and that little pink, a little shot of pain, not very much pain really, but that's a pattern interrupt. And one other way that we could do this is taking photos of our meals. So when we do an action like that, just taking a photo, there's no weighing or counting calories or anything like that, but what we're doing is we're engaging our conscious brain now when we go to eat. So number 3 is design your environment. So going back to Costco-sized bags of junk food. So one time my wife brought home this Costco-sized bag of peanut M&Ms. And I really like peanut M&Ms. So recognizing, that I really like them, and this is a giant bag, I thought, well, what I need to do is put them somewhere where it's really inconvenient to get to them. And so I buried them in the bottom of my pantry behind like a bag of flour and a big old jar of pickles. And this is kind of related to creating friction. But other ways to potentially design the environment could be, for example, maybe I ask my wife not to bring home certain foods that for me are a trigger food or one that I struggle to regulate. Another way to sort of design our environment would be to make fruits and vegetables visible and easily accessible, whether it's in a bowl on the counter or in kind of the higher up shelves instead of like buried in the bottom of a crisper, just kind of, staying there until they rot. Put them somewhere where they're visible and easily accessible. Because remember, we make 35,000 decisions a day. The less that we can waste those, it's a big number, but it's also a finite number. And the less of those decisions that we can waste unnecessarily on willpower, the easier it is for us. So number 4 is actually just a really simple one. And that's this idea of slow down with a breath. So let's try this right now. Just, let's pause and go. And as you breathe out, just think about as your shoulders start to sink down and you're breathing out, imagine like the weight of the world lifting off your shoulders. That is, I like the idea that's the fastest and most portable way to really kind of slow down our fast brain and bring us into our conscious brain, is that one breath is all it takes. And so when you try that, when you do that breath in and that slow out breath, what do you notice? What do you feel? What do you become aware of when you do that? So for me, for example, I notice that as my shoulders fall, I kind of envision like the weight of the world lifting off my shoulders. So number 5, there's a way that we could kind of say like speed up the slow brain. That's an easier way to remember, but what we're really talking about here is actually a transfer of a slow brain skill to a fast brain. So when we first try to learn a new habit, we have to use conscious brain power to do it. So we have to use our slow brain to learn a new habit. But the more that we repeat that habit or that behavior, the less we need to use the slow brain because it starts to get transferred to the fast brain. And so the other thing that we want to think about is if we can make that behavior small and almost mindless. Like, yes, it might need a conscious cue or a little bit of input to get us to do it. But the smaller and the simpler and the more repeatable we can make that behavior, the easier it is to do. And if that behavior has a high degree of repeatability, that's how we can really ensure that we make a transfer from the slow brain to the fast brain. So number 6 is simply plan your meals. So we have more willpower in the morning than we do at the end of the day. And if at the end of the day you're tired and you don't have anything planned out, you're just more likely to go off track and make less than helpful decisions and sort of push off responsibility until the next day. It's just kind of how our brains work. So if you had something planned in advance, whether that's, maybe putting a meal in the slow cooker, cutting up some veggies in the morning or on the weekend, or even just using frozen vegetables, that sort of thing. If you kind of have a plan in advance of what you're going to eat so that when you get home, you don't really have to think about the dinner that you're going to prepare, you're less likely to go off track. So I'm going to wrap it up there and just say, what did you find the most helpful? So quickly to summarize, number 1 was introduce friction, so slow down that automatic behavior. Number 2 was a pattern interrupt, that sticking out on the bag of chips or a rubber band on your wrist. Number 3 was design your environment, so maybe putting fruit on the counter or veggies in the top of your fridge. Number 4 was slow down with a breath, just like that. Number 5, we called it speed up the slow brain, but really what we're doing is we're doing the transfer from the slow brain to the fast brain, making that habit simple and repeatable. And number 6 is plan your meals. So just, again, do the decision-making when the willpower is fresh and strong rather than at the end of the day when you're reaching the place of decision fatigue. So for me, very often I use friction. It's just, it makes things a lot easier for me. Bury that bag of M&Ms in the pantry, put those chocolates in the freezer, that kind of thing. So hopefully you found this helpful. Thank you so much for tuning in and watching. I really hope that you're inspired and encouraged as you see how you can take control and use both your fast brain and your slow brain to set yourself up for success. So I look forward to seeing you in the next video.